Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the third of the Conscious in the Cloud talks. The pleasure of introducing Reese Jones this evening. Reese attended our second talk and promptly discussed that we return to the format of the first talk. So Reese is going to be presenting a few slides, I believe, and then we'll be getting into some discussion. So I hope you came with plenty of ideas, plenty of thoughts, plenty of provocative things to say. This is all being recorded. I will release it in an audio podcast. I'll be providing the video to Reese. He can do with what he will with the video. But I'll also be roving through the audience with mics. So if you'd like to talk, because it is being recorded, please raise your hand and I'll come around with a mic and pass it on to you.
You introduce yourself.
Oh. It's been one of those days. I'm Tom Barbalet. I work at Netflix. I'm also the creator of the Noble Ape Simulation, which is an artificial life project that I've been running now for about 17 years. Very much looking now at ideas of distributed consciousness, ideas of language narrative, these kind of things is what I'm working on currently. And I started this talk as an ability to... There was a series of talks called Grey Thumb that were in the Bay Area. In fact, it was an international phenomenon from the Netherlands, the UK, Boston, the Bay Area. We had Zangil, one of the folks who attended the Grey Thumbs, maybe a couple of other Grey Thumbers, maybe not. So, yeah, I was very much inspired by the Grey Thumb talks, but I thought because the nature of cloud computing is providing just an amazing kind of tapestry for folks who are dealing already with bottom-up intelligence models, that this was a perfect venue to bring some of the people that I knew and some of the people from the kind of broader cloud community together in these discussions. So we've had two so far, and Reese is going to set off the third.
So this is the third meetup on consciousness in the cloud, and this is a relatively new thing, obviously, and it's intended to be a discussion, and I'm going to run through a few slides to set some context coming maybe from a biology point of view as to that might provoke some interesting conversation. The premise I'm operating from is that the internet is already conscious and we're just not conscious of that. I'm open to disagreement. And so the question is, if the internet is part of the ecosystem of the planet and both are conscious at a level that we as elements of that can't understand, the question is that consciousness evolving, and in what way are we evolving as part of that? And this is predicated on a few assumptions of what's necessary for consciousness in the way that it's talked about. And these are the ones that I'll sort of set forth quickly here that we can talk about, but being non-deterministic elements that are differentiated with a certain level of complexity, and this sets up for a global organism. And there's a few things that are test cases in biological organisms that when you're trying to do a computer simulation of consciousness or conscious life, for it to be similar to biology, they have to work, and I'll touch on those. And then in the evolution of things and complexity, one of the characteristics of evolution is speciation, where two different directions going from a single origin. So as I mentioned, in my opinion, internet is already conscious. And the question is, if that's the case, why would we be aware of that at all? Any more than the cells in our finger are aware of what we're talking about right now. That is sort of a presumption, anthropocentric presumption that we as humans are the highest form of consciousness that there is, and that we're aware of levels of consciousness beyond our own. So the characteristics of the internet, of course, there's already billions of processors, billions of sensors on those processors, billions of people on the internet. So the internet already has 1 billion people on it, so it's at least as smart and as conscious as 1 billion people. And that people are an indivisible element of the internet the way it functions now. There's trillions of interconnections, and as the Internet of Things is, as some people like to call it, is evolving, there's more and more simple things being attached as elements of the internet. And then there's billions of things. And people aren't the only things that are being attached to the internet through synthetic biology and other ways of thinking about biology. There's billions of living things that can be converted from data into life or life back into data. And this whole collection is a complex ecosystem. And the main distinction that I run into dealing with people who come at this kind of stuff from the computer side versus those who come from the biology side is the fundamental, almost ideological split is that from computer engineering, you come with the point of view that things are deterministic and you can program and control things and you can actually determine the outcome, which comes from a point of view of physics and math, and is an attractive assumption, but it doesn't really work in biophysics or in biology or in chemistry or into quantum effects and so forth, in that biology is basically analog and computers being digital. And analog is not the same as digital. You can use digital to approximate analog, but the dynamics in the subtleties are different, which may mean that the dynamics at scale are different. So some of you have probably seen there's Edward Tufte graph of brain-body ratio of different species, where from small into large, the brain to body ratio is kind of a measure of intelligence, but it's the different kinds of somewhat sentient species fall along a line with a slope of 3/4. And you notice there's nothing in the upper left-hand side of this chart, which is interesting in that there's evolution has selected kind of a boundary or a barrier that being smarter than above that line doesn't seem to have any evolutionary persistence. So it may not be of value to be extra smart beyond that line. So from the point of view of a global planet, the human body is a lot more of the data that makes up a person and how a person thinks and feels and so forth in their brain. From the point of view of a person, we think about our brain as being the center point of our consciousness, but it may not be the case. And the same 3/4 slope, also Jeffrey West from Santa Fe Institute predicted a body size to essentially respiration rate. And so a larger organism like a whale has a very slow heart rate and a very slow breathing rate, and a mouse or a hummingbird or a bat has a much faster heart rate and breathing rate. And if you extend this 3/4 line on the double exponential curve up further to buildings in cities, they also have a respiration rate and a heart rate where if you consider the commute hour into a city and out of a city, it's somewhat predictive, similar along the same ratio of size to pace, which is also a little bit predictive of longevity. So a city and a human are sort of a complex system that has a respiration, a breathing, and other characteristics. Rainforest is another example of a very complex system that has its own rhythms and paces. One of the interesting things in a rainforest is most of the signaling channels are full with at least one species, and very often what's evolved is for species to be sharing signaling channels, so frogs and birds tweeting on the same frequency, but in a code that doesn't get confused between them. Other examples of complexity with diversity is coral reefs, for example, but all of these likely share some element of a respiration cycle, an awake-sleep cycle, some way of reproduction and how they evolve over time and then how they speciate into different things. So the important element about a human is that most of the cells in a human actually don't have human DNA. We're born with mostly human DNA, but by count, the number of cells in our body that are microbes or viruses or bacteria or fungi outnumbers the number of human DNA cells. And so some of the elements of consciousness are likely not only in the brain, just as our keeping track of our breathing or our digestion is not in our conscious mind. And so it's a more complex system with more diffused elements. There's not a central processor, if you will. Part of this complexity from an evolutionary point of view is evolution from undifferentiated cells to differentiated cells, where for a couple billion years was prokaryotes, which are single-cell organisms that essentially have one container, and the sort of unique leap in biological evolution was going from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, and the fundamental difference is a eukaryote has a cell within a cell, so a mitochondria inside a cell, and both reproduce together and form more complex structures, but that multi-processor element is an important thing about how biological life evolved. And for those trying to do simulated life or simulated consciousness or intelligence, there's this complexity is maybe a necessary element, that it can't be done with simple homogeneous processors. The way connected cells evolved into differentiated cells is there's the physical connection of the cells pushing against each other, which is a communication mechanism. There's the way the nutrients and waste are routed around. There's some element of an immune system of self and other. There's signaling through chemistry, electrical, optical, and then a big difference in a complex cellular life system from many of the computer simulations is there are global signals equivalent to hormones that aren't regularly put into simulations. In differentiated cells, as I mentioned, just to gloss over this, is there's compartments within cells that have special function, or within a body, organ systems. And in those organ systems, there's local regulation. So in the liver has different rules if you're a cell in a liver than if you're a cell in a finger. And the cells in your finger and in your liver have the genetics to become a tooth, and sometimes of their apparent free will, they decide to mutate and become a tooth in the middle of your liver or in the middle of your finger, and that's called a cancer. And that is locally regulated in biology, where the immune system regulates that to be in conformance with the local rules. So if you extend that thinking into politics or whatever, and different regions of the planet have different areas of specialization, and whether there should be local rules that rule as an immune system or a global system that regulates things is an open question, but probably a combination of local plus global it will evolve. The signaling can also either be local, and a lot of the Connectome project is looking at the electrical signals that in the brain, which are a tiny fraction of the signaling that's going on between neurons and between cells, where most of it is chemical. Neurotransmitters are triggering the electrical signals, and the things that are expressed metabolically are having much larger effects than just the electrical signals. And then if in this ecosystem of a body or a city or there's multiple different diversity of species or diversity of organs located in either a symbiotic way or a parasitic way, and things that are, for example, microbes in our intestine that are normally healthy to be there can turn parasitic if the ratios change. So in this chemistry versus bits, sort of analog versus digital, or statistical versus deterministic way of thinking, there's a couple tests that you can do if you're trying to do synthetic life or synthetic artificial intelligence, where in a non-deterministic system like a human body, there are slow wave chemicals that affect all the cells in different ways. So, for example, hormones affect all the cells over a long cycle, and there are things like cutting off the oxygen to somebody will change their consciousness very rapidly, or adding in chemicals like alcohol or nitrous oxide will change things globally. So a computer simulation that is trying to emulate the way the brain works simply by its electrical connections has to have some way, if it's going to be similarly intelligent to a human, it has to have some way to respond to these global variable type things, of which there are many. And so it's sort of at the interface between digital and analog. Some of you have seen this perhaps, that the digital is deterministic and the analog is doing a lot of processing too, and they're working in conjunction. But the analog has a little bit of extra free will that has it sometimes behave in unpredictable ways. So to try and sort of wrap this up a little bit from an introduction point of view, that also open with the premise that consciousness is a continuum from non-consciousness to fully alert and awake. And I might put awake on top of flow states, but there's being sleepy, there's being asleep, there's dreaming, which is sort of running simulations that are checking memories. There's housekeeping, fixing errors from your day's experience to match the memories that you've had. And then there's coma states, and there's what we call biological death. And this is like a dial. Maybe it goes to 11, but it's still an analog dial. And people go up and down this continuum based on chemistry and a lot of other factors. So this picture is a picture of all the IP version 4 router traffic globally on the internet. and it's a 24-hour picture. And if you look at it, the activity, the red and yellow activity, moves around the Earth with the sunlight and the awakeness of the humans. And so there's local activity in those routers that are essentially the awake state or the busy state. And the blue on the chart are where there's less traffic in those routers. However, there's little hot spots of red within the blue, which is some elements of, essentially this is the internet being awake and asleep as it goes around the Earth. And there's where the activity is the fast connections to people while they're awake and busy, and then the slow sort of housekeeping consolidation stuff that happens in the night, synchronizing servers and such. So these elements may also be from awake to sleep to death may also be true in terms of a biological internet. So that's as an introduction. There is this concept of non-determinism, differentiated elements, complexity, a global scale, and the implications of that. Some of the test things from biology that relate for testing consciousness or experimenting with consciousness. And then speciation may be interesting to talk about. So that's the introduction.
Thank you, Reese. So do we have any questions? I might kick it off, Reese, as I have the microphone to start off with. These kind of discussions have gone through the artificial life community for a long period of time. One of my favourites is the fact that we aren't having a discussion associated with automobile manufacturer, associated with how it should be more like horses or more like humans. We've come to a place where we're perfectly comfortable with cars being entities that get us places considerably better than our bodies. And we don't have any biological metaphors associated with cars, although you can draw them. This model is very interesting in terms of your discussion of biology, and I think people who've explored particularly neurochemistry and these kind of things have created amazing models of intelligence, but they haven't created the only models. Can you talk a little bit about, or actually can you go back a slide maybe to your list and talk about the various weightings that you would see in terms of the internet? I mean, do you see the internet in biological models, or do you see it in terms of complexity or these kind of things being stronger and an equal determination of consciousness and potentially life?
Well, from my point of view, the internet is almost equal parts biological life from a billion humans attached to it, and phones and computers and servers and the wires connecting them, in that the internet's most of its activity now is a combination of biological activity and electronic activity. And there are, so in some sense, if you imagine each of the cells of our body having a mitochondria that's inside the cells that's evolved to be an essential part of our genetics, it's its own organism with its own separate genome that is part of all of our cells, and it replicates with the cells, and we wouldn't function without it. The way that's interesting for me to think about is that we as human beings are like mitochondria inside the internet, in that the internet wouldn't really function as a complex system without millions of humans making sure that it's working.
Certainly.
So it seems like, I don't buy the idea that the internet is anywhere close to even as complex as a single human being, because there are 5 orders of magnitude in terms of the count of the number of connections and units in the internet compared to a single human body. Right? You have 10 to the 13 in a human body versus 10 to the 9 that's inside the internet right now. So it's 5 orders of magnitude. But even that being the case, maybe I'm missing a term of definition between consciousness versus living. It seems like you're going in a potential direction of proving that the internet might be alive, which would be an interesting discussion to have. But I don't see any kind of evidence in the discussion so far that would be to say that it is conscious, meaning to be that it would be self-aware in some meaningful way, where I could have that discussion with you about a dolphin, I could have that discussion with you about a crow, the famous recent video of with the crow solving puzzles and stuff like that. And also to say that the internet, and I know these are a lot of questions, that's the main question, but as a corollary to that, you talk about humans as being equivalent to mitochondria, but then you also say that the internet is intelligent because it has the intelligence of a billion human beings. My intelligence or your intelligence has nothing to do with the level of intelligence of a mitochondria or even an individual cell. The two have no relationship to one another. Our consciousness is emergent, that comes from who we are as an aggregated being, and has nothing to do with the intelligence of a single cell or the intelligence of mitochondria. So the intelligence of a human being as an input into the internet has no bearing on whether or not it's intelligent or conscious. If what you're saying is true, you may be going in a direction saying it's alive, but I don't see any discussion that would lead us into the direction of saying that it is conscious.
So that's cool thoughts. I mean, on the whole, the first orders of magnitude issues is it's true that I agree that the internet is much simpler in terms of its element complexity than the connections inside a single person, if you don't count the people that are in the internet. If you count the billion people that are in the internet as highly interconnected elements of the internet, you add their complexity to the dynamics of the internet. So the order of magnitude calculation is an interesting way to think about it. If you include the humans, and they're there. And then the aspect of consciousness we could have the same discussion about is the palm tree less conscious than the dog, which is less conscious than the human, and intelligence aside. Like that's, to me, what I'm trying to describe as sort of a continuum of awareness, where a grove of redwoods might be conscious of where the water is or things that we're not so much paying attention to. But it's a consciousness in a sense of it's a living structure that has resistance to entropy. And some of the things that it metabolically does is to resist entropy and respond to its environment. And so that's a big stretch of using the word conscious, but that's sort of turning the dial way to the left in a sense.
A crystal would be conscious in some sense then, according to that definition, yeah?
That's quite possible.
The paleobiologist Roy Plotnick, who has appeared in the recordings that this will go into, talks about survival as being the metric of intelligence, which removes yourself from the anthropomorphic nature that consciousness has. And if you look at the Precambrian and the early Cambrian and the way organisms irked their way towards food centers, that was the first encoding of survivability in life. But there are parallels of survivability in what we would traditionally think of as being non-living systems. The redwoods are an interesting kind of cross example. But it's interesting when you talk about consciousness with regards to machines, you need to move away from the anthropomorphic nature of your perception of consciousness in order to get a greater understanding. And that, for many, is very difficult. But when you work with these systems for long periods of time, you start to realize that survivability is actually a kind of lower rung metric of intelligence, and you can develop an interesting framing of consciousness within that metric.
So I'll buy the continuum for the moment. So the question is, you began by saying that you think that the internet is conscious today, and I'm wondering what you saw there that convinced you that, and when did you decide it was? I mean, when did this happen? Was it last year or 2 years ago or a decade ago? And what level of in the continuum would you say it is right now?
Well, from homebrew phone hacking background of old, that the complexity of the phone network, even as touch-tone automatic switching was introduced, started to have elements of emergent systems behavior that wasn't easy to predict. And part of what made it hard to predict, as a node at a single phone sending tones into the complexity, was in that complexity were humans tweaking the system to respond to what was happening. And so in some sense, as the complexity of the global phone network and power grid has increased, and you add faster signaling, which is essentially internet, the complexity of the system as a whole is increasing at a rapid pace, and the way it behaves feels to me increasingly biological as a system, and that if you poke it, it responds, and the response is a combination of the power and the sensors and the signaling, but also there's some humans in there responding in some way, either pre-programmed or live.
So it seems like there's a continuum of life, there's a continuum of intelligence,
there's a continuum of consciousness, right? Is that one continuum, or are we talking about three different continuums? It's kind of his question is like, you've just described how it's becoming biological, maybe more lifelike. Is this the same continuum where we have it's more and more lifelike? Is it also becoming more and more intelligent? Is it also becoming more and more conscious? Is this a single continuum, or are these three parallel continuums?
Well, so I would agree with your technium concept of it being a single continuum. That whether the elements are biochemical or electrical, that it's complexity evolving that may have evolved for a long time. There's an interesting projection of whether or not something is alive, going from prokaryotes to eukaryotes to complex plants and animals. If you project that on a double exponential graph back in time, the humans, animals, plants, eukaryotes and prokaryotes project back over 4.5 billion years. If you keep projecting that back to where the complexity of what is a prokaryote or a eukaryote today, and you project that back to where does it intersect zero, like when did it originate? It intersects zero at somewhere like 10 billion years ago. And the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. And so the prokaryote single-cell life on Earth, the complexity of it is such that it's at a level of complexity that it unlikely originated here. And that the projection back to the intersection of zero may have errors in it. It may be a slightly super exponential curve. And so if you project that back, it could actually project back to 13 billion years ago, which would, of course, is the Big Bang, and that the 0 point of sort of the anti-entropic characteristic of life maybe originated near the origin of matter, and that it's evolved along this somewhat super exponential curve for 13 billion years to where it is now, and we're experiencing how it's manifest locally, but it might be different in other locations. Does that answer your thought, or?
Not really, but there's also the possibility that backward extrapolation. What if it showed it 20 billion years?
Well, the people who've done that, I can't remember their names right offhand, but their extrapolation went back to 8 or 9 billion years. But if you look at these exponential curves, most of them, Moore's law even, seem to have a slightly upward bend to them, or Cooper's law or whatnot. And so there's another factor in the equation that is leading not to just a simple linear exponential growth. So if you take that into account, you would forecast it back further than 9 billion years to more like 13 billion years as a thought. And there's another element that sort of addresses both of this, life, non-life, or intelligent, non-intelligent, conscious, what that, there's this normal human instinct to be dualistic and to think this is different than that, and that there's a hard line in between. And for me, that I think of things more as being on a continuum, and where's the shades of gray in between rather than the on-off switch. So the distinction between is a crystal alive or a rock versus a microbe in the rock, that's sort of a continuum. And in particular, this, when interacting with biologists, there's the discussion about whether or not a virus is alive, and that a virus is a prion, and that viruses and prions are very simple molecular forms of life, in my opinion, but they can't live without a complex organism reproducing them on their behalf. So some biologists would argue that viruses and prions are not alive, and because they're dependent on other life to reproduce. But then again, people are dependent on food to reproduce. So it's a similar argument as far as not being a distinction between, or a hard line distinction between alive and not alive.
It seems that a lot of this boils down to personal opinion, not scientific rigor with regards to the way we draw some of these lines. So for example, I have what would potentially be an equally valid perspective on the topic, which means that consciousness would be relating more to the survivability aspect, and in particular with regards to the ability of an organism to contemplate the future in a meaningful way. And so when I hear consciousness, that's what I think about. But that's an ascientific way of looking at it, right? It's an opinion. There's no scientific rigor I can apply to justify my perspective. And in fact, there is no consensus about the definition of what consciousness actually means today.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of what informs this list and the hierarchy of this list, in that like somebody enlightened and awake may be more conscious than somebody who is merely awake, who is seeking and idle, basically, which may be more active frontal lobe conscious than somebody who's in a flow state, that is more conscious than somebody who is sleepy or asleep, who are more conscious than somebody who's in a coma or under anesthesia. And so the same physical person is at different levels of consciousness at different times of day. And it looks as though from this chart, the internet is similar.
See, there's a joke.
Yeah.
That's the joke.
We're actually sitting here in a model of consciousness, because probably the traditional model of consciousness is the theater, and here we are interacting with each other, probably following a process very much like what we're doing when we're thinking and interacting with each other. And so what when listening to what you're saying and stuff, what I think a good model of consciousness is that there's, I'm going to call it a phenomenological boundary between the external world and an internal world, and a process which tries to create a model inside in the internal world of what's going on in the external world. And that process is what consciousness is. And by that definition, of course, the internet's doing it, and probably even a microbe that kind of is following a gradient is doing it if it has some sort of internal model of which way to go.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, internal and external models. I sort of glossed over the concept of quorum sensing, which is how communities of bacteria make decisions as a group, in that they're increasing the concentration of the signaling molecule between them. And when it gets to a certain level, they all do something together. Like they say, let's make this dude sneeze so we can get on to the next person. And that's a decision-making, a consciousness, where the elements are acting as a group, but the decision-making is a chemical that's flowing between the elements. So it's not really an internal thing, it's an external thing. And it's like a group election in that sense. And then this internal, external, predicting the future is like the classical definition of consciousness and intelligence and whatnot. And so that whether like my dog can predict that I'm going to come home and give it dinner or not, it seems to me that it is assuming I'm going to come home.
The model as you describe is exactly the early model that I used in Noble Ape to create the simulation, both in terms of the external world and the internal world. The additional component was language. And I think we have a very high level view of what consciousness is. But if you look at the day-to-day human experience, a lot of it is predicated on language. So irrespective of how complex we are as organisms, we are running a linguistic program. So whether we're programmed by Allah or Dawkins or what have you, we are running a program. And that is a very interesting view of consciousness, particularly in terms of the internet. But I like your description because it's exactly what I started with Noble Ape, in terms of those being the fundamentals of looking at consciousness.
You're raising some really interesting questions. It seems to me that to start to untangle the Gordian knot, that you have to start with evolution, because evolution has been shown to occur in non-living systems. And evolution then brings about emergence. And it seems to me that then the distinction between non-life and life lies at that moment when the struggle for existence can begin. Because non-life doesn't struggle for existence. And so once you have the struggle for existence and the force of evolution, and then these continual levels of aggregates becoming individuals, the idea of Leo Bus. This question of when does that arise, turn into something we could call consciousness. It seems to me, we could debate what consciousness really is. Your definition seems like a good one, but one might equate consciousness as some level of capacity to struggle for existence. And make that connection.
So that essential element of struggle for existence is a linguistic thing, assuming a kind of a motivation.
Well, that was Darwin's the third chapter of Origin of Species.
Yeah,
and that's the which he intended to develop more.
Yeah,
and it seems to me that that's the part that we have tended to miss in our overly simplistic view of Darwinian evolution as random variation and environmental selection. We've forgotten that there's the struggle for existence. And a number of biologists are bringing that back, like Kirshner and Gerhardt, with their theory of facilitated variation. But that is the core directionality. And so then the question is, when you look at the internet, I think you can find a whole series of connections, say speciation. I think you can find analogs to speciation in the internet, a range of evolutionary processes in the internet. And the question is, then where would you say that there was a coherent struggle for existence? Right?
Well, the internet needs electricity. And so it has a struggle to get electricity, and it induces the humans, much like a flower induces a bee, to bring it electricity. So in that sense, it is making it known to the humans what it needs, and the humans need it.
And it's a symbiotic relationship.
It makes your
making these language leaps about saying the internet decides. Please give an example of how the internet is inducing human beings' behavior. I can see how humans are delivering electricity to the internet, but how is, because the internet is being used by the humans, but I don't see how the internet is inducing the humans to do so.
So we're here in the Netflix headquarters building, and Netflix delivers entertainment to humans, and they deliver it over the internet plumbing that is in part controlled by Comcast. And Comcast is trying to maintain control of their plumbing and deliver competing entertainment to Netflix. And they were in a struggle as far as how that was done, and eventually came to an equilibrium where Netflix now gives Comcast money to have their entertainment to the humans delivered faster. And so the humans were saying that the internet is not behaving the way they want it to behave with regard to delivery of Netflix. The element that was not cooperating, the barrier, was Comcast, and the result was sort of a chemical equilibrium, if you will, of these different elements to the amount of money that's paid to deliver the movies in an acceptable way.
The way you just described are human beings negotiating with each other to secure a limited resource, which is cash, right? They're negotiating with each other and using this medium to do so. In no sense was the medium itself the motivator. In the same argument, I could say that the zeros and ones in my bank account are inducing me to go and earn money, right? So that they can have more friends to reproduce, so that I can put them into a mutual fund and they will grow and reproduce by the same logic. But it's me. I'm doing it. It's not the money doing it.
It's kind of provocative, what I'm saying, right?
I'm just asking you to make the case. There's some underlying phenomenology of this exponential growth, in that most people are familiar with Moore's law of exponential pace of processing size, which turns out to be processing power. But there's a similar law, Marty Cooper's law, who invented the cell phone, that is also an exponential curve going back 100 years from Morse code on the Titanic to, G4 phones with watching movies, fitting a pretty straight exponential line. And these exponential technologies, as Kevin sort of points out, may be emergent kind of phenomena, evolutionary emergent phenomena, leading to increasing complexity. And the complexity is of the complex system, which might have chemical elements and human elements and plant elements and copper and fiber and different materials, but it's becoming a more complex organism or structure, or something that is resisting entropy to fall apart, and is directing resources to keep it together, or in fact improve it exponentially. But by that argument, you're simply saying that humanity as a collective entity is becoming a new organism, and that the internet is a means by which humanity is becoming a new collective organism, which is an interesting thought. But that has nothing to do with the intelligence or connectivity, or you're basically giving conscious attribution to the medium when it's not the medium. It's the elements that are on the medium, which in this case are the human beings. Take away the human beings and there is nothing. That's it.
Take away the machinery and you don't have it either.
Yes,
So this is an interesting man-machine symbiotic system. And I think that's the point.
Complexity is inherent in the universe. We could go and get and run a rule. I forgot what it is, but anyway, you talk about what Wolfram came up with regards to the cellular automata classes, right? And you have the chaotic cellular automata classes, class 3, if I'm not mistaken. With a very simple set of rules, you can create even though it's deterministic, you cannot predict the outcome. So there's the join between organics and non-organics. So I don't know. I feel like we're talking about the medium, not the thing.
Okay. I kind of agree that the medium here is the internet and the organism still the human. But the fact is we are at an inflection point where the traffic on the internet is quickly going to turn away from being dominated by human action at the time and into thousands and millions and billions of sensors and actuators in M2M, machine-to-machine communication, at which point the internet becomes a medium of communication for a lot of dumb devices. And the percentage of traffic generated by human beings is going to pale in comparison. So at what point does the organism change at that?
But all of those devices are at the behest of human beings. So the humans are still the motive force, right? The human will, the sensor that is deployed in my backyard, for example, that is sending out weather data to Weather Underground automatically. I'm just thinking something random, right? Or the stuff that's in my car that is sending data off to Lord knows where, the insurance company or wherever, right? Those are still subject to the human motive force. Yes, the traffic will be very much dominated by the interconnectings in the machines. And in fact, you could even say that now, that a lot of the traffic is backup data for financial institutions and, backing up of the largest user of bandwidth on the internet in whose theater we are sitting today, right? So there's all these kinds of things that are non-human generated traffic. And yeah, that will definitely be the case for machines. We're talking to machines. I think it's kind of already the case. And it's already the case these machines are going to be.
But we're talking about machines that can also eventually have actuators and make things happen on their own. And now we're going right back to the point where you made, where a bunch of little small deterministic, rather dumb things interacting start making for something bigger and more complex that has no human interaction with it at that point.
Kind of like the stock market does today with robot trading, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other provocations I was trying to evoke tonight was that to take humans out of the equation, and that this complexity may be an emergent evolutionary thing, whether or not there's humans. And that there were complex networks of, hooved animals walking deer trails through the forest before there was humans. And those networks adapted to all kinds of things, and that's a complex network that's adaptive with no human intervention. And humans have a long history of anthropocentric bias from, Copernicus to Galileo and so on, that, if we can turn that off for a moment and imagine what if this has nothing to do with us, and if this is an emergent behavior that is not driven by human intelligence but following, for example, agriculture, that before there was agriculture, humans didn't stay in one place very long. And agriculture, the plants, in a Dawkins way, tricked the humans into staying there and taking care of these plants. And it fed them and changed the species from nomadic to agricultural. And so the force that changed species and allowed, 7 billion humans instead of 500 million was driven by plants.
But it's an opinion of perspective,
yes.
right? So
yes.
that's not a fact. That's an opinion of perspective, and there's two equally valid ways of interpreting that data point. One is that the humans put the plants in their service. The other is that the plants put the humans in their service, and it depends on your point of view. And so I think
this has been a 3 back and forths on this very topic.
Okay, so I love what you're saying in terms of life being a pattern in time that attempts to repeat itself, and intelligence sort of, I think that we're saying that intelligence is sort of the density of those patterns that are trying to repeat themselves. So is there any sort of cool software out there right now that's trying to make the most dense, flexible patterns that are attempting to repeat themselves, like a more efficient version of Noble Ape or Polyworld?
Tom would be better to answer that.
I'm working to make the most efficient version of Noble Ape possible. In fact, the whole reason that I started this series of talks actually was because I was looking to move Noble Ape into the cloud. And that was part of the motivation. Basically, it was to bring in cloud people and also talk about Noble Ape in the context of moving it into the cloud. Prior to this talk, John and I and Reese were discussing this. In fact, I think Reese hadn't arrived yet. But yeah, I'm very interested actually in taking existing artificial life simulations and running them in the cloud. There's a historical legacy with this associated with Tierra as well. Tom Ray was very interested in doing this with Tierra. The cloud technology just wasn't there at the time when he did it. So there's a kind of legacy history in the artificial life community of trying to do this.
And I'm very actively interested in the mirror of that, which is how to run things in biochemistry built with synthetic DNA that is plugged into systems that becomes alive. So in 2010, the first self-reproducing life form where all of the genetic code came from a computer into synthetic DNA, booted up as a self-replicating cell by Craig Venter. That is a simulation running in biochemistry, with the compute elements being the code written in DNA and the chemistry that happens around it.
Any questions from folks who haven't asked questions so far? Any other questions? No?
An easy question, because I think I misunderstood a little bit the objective of the meeting. I thought consciousness it's human consciousness, and we don't care about the internet is conscious and the frog is conscious. So I was thinking about Ray Kurzweil's vision that we have the implant and connected to the cloud. So the simple question is, do you think that at some point my consciousness can live in the cloud, and what would it take?
So I know Ray well, and the concept of my consciousness, if my consciousness is in my body right now, and I made a copy of my consciousness in the internet, there would be two of my consciousnesses. And so in order for there to be only one would have to die. And so there's probably no reason you couldn't have my consciousness multiply into many, and the other versions of it each would have its own path, in a sense. So if you look at Facebook as a very primitive version of you in the internet, the more data that it has, the more accurately it can appear to other people to be you. In that, as this evolves, the way that we each represent ourselves in the cloud will become more and more sophisticated and become more and more scripted, and it is already becoming a little bit ambiguous whether that entity that you're dealing with online is an actual human, is a human who scripts it and checks it occasionally, is a bot, or isn't a human at all. Or are they alive or dead? It's that interface is much less clear. And there's a phenomenon that's interesting in that those people that are highly digitized, Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe, Michael Jackson, the Beatles, and so forth, are relatively easy to reconstruct an experience of interacting with their personality, often in Vegas and Cirque du Soleil doing, an experience with one of those characters. The more data they have to work with, the more complete they can have that experience be. In fact, it can be better than dealing with the real person. So more interesting than the alive person. And so that's a phenomenon that this sort of exponential representation of who is me and what are the elements of me, that's changing. Like Eric Schmidt says that for every person on Earth, there's at least 9 versions of online. So most people here have at least 5 or 20 internet personas. So the population of the internet is actually 50 billion people, where the population of biological people is only 7 billion. So it's getting a little confusing as far as what is me in the present moment, in the past, in the future, and that kind of thing. But the clear distinction is, if I have 2 copies of me, why does one of them have to die?
And what happens to the audio of this is it goes on the Internet Archive. And I know for a matter of fact that thousands of people listen to this audio. And over the past 10 years, people have picked up the audio, 10 years after it was recorded and still thought about it. And that is a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, pending fires in the Internet Archive, in 100, 200 years' time, this audio could still be available, people could still be listening in, and, maybe siding with one of the speakers and then being turned to another speaker. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and it's completely beyond what has existed previously, even with the written published word.
Absolutely.
So, as this other fellow at the end was speaking, it occurred to me that there's at least 3 kinds of cloud-based consciousness that have come up this evening, and one is this idea of the expanded individual consciousness that this could be augmented. The cloud could augment my consciousness by expanding it in some way, either duplicating it, or I like to think of it though as an expanded consciousness. So that's one way that you have a cloud consciousness. The second way would be that there would be a developed AI, like on the movie Her, or a Google AI that is so good that it's a manufactured design AI that becomes conscious. And then there seems to be a third way, which is what you're kind of suggesting, which is this sort of global entity itself, having a kind of global cloud consciousness. And so it may be that those 3 things are not the same, and they could all happen at the same time. But there may even be others. And so maybe that's one of the things we could do is, are there other forms besides those 3 of global consciousness?
Well, I would say plants are another example, in that how they exist, where they choose to propagate, where how they resist entropy, is some form of intelligence or consciousness, or
Is it cloud-based?
it goes over the whole planet. So, and as birds move the seeds from this continent to that continent, or bees, are evidently bees are having catastrophic hive deaths on every continent except Australia. So there's something that has diffused across all the other continents that has yet to reach Australia that is interfering with a colony life form where there's a queen bee and there's worker bees and a hive, and it works in a hive type dynamic in the same way we work in a body or we work in a community. But that the dynamics of that isn't individual autonomous units, it's interdependent units that have some collective agenda or collective survival action.
Can anyone else imagine a electronically cloud-based consciousness besides the 3 that I mentioned?
Could you summarize the 3 again?
Well, the 3 aren't...
The three is one, an
Expanded first one is an expanded individual consciousness. So it's like my consciousness amplified by the ability to be augmented with the capability of sensors around the world, kind of being able to see through other cameras anywhere. So I have an expanded global being. And the second one is a cloud-based intelligence, like the movie Her, or Google making something successful that would be a cloud-based intelligence, that would be an AI.
Or a corporation.
Or corporation. And then the third one is this vision that you were kind of outlining, which is all the artifacts, the billions of sensors and the trillions and quadrillions of CPUs connected together, forming their own emergent global consciousness. Those are the 3 that I can imagine very easily, but I'm, asking which ones am I missing? Again, it's not this organic version that you were talking about, but a electronic, cloud-based, global, or cloud-based consciousness. Electronic, cloud-based consciousness, which I think is the topic, right?
Well, another one could potentially be free-ranging internet life forms, right? So it's not the entire internet that has become alive, but pieces of code that have become alive on the internet in some meaningful way and move through the internet. We've been talking about that since the first worm attacks back in the late 80s.
And that would be different from the second one in what sense? That it's designed. It's an emergent?
It's either an emergent thing or it's something that wasn't created by purpose. Might have been accidentally created.
Yeah, thank you.
So there's another one which would be the extension of, I mean, if you think about it, your consciousness and just groups of human beings, you know, like the U.S. government or, you know, Netflix or some other group like that, they're going to use the cloud to extend themselves. So they'll be kind of like somewhere in between the AI and the extension of an individual.
Yeah, that's a level of abstraction perhaps more complex than corporations. But the different distinction between a corporation and a country or nation state are kind of blurring.
It's also artificial to think of these things as distinct things, as independent entities, because they actually all work together. And the notion of the Gestalt here, I think, is very important, because what we're seeing is the Gestalt. We're not seeing one of these things, or that they're competing or can be individually looked at. They're working together. And maybe that togetherness, that Gestalt, actually gives more than the independent parts in terms of what we're trying to describe. In fact, that's the difficulty of mapping language onto what we see or what we're trying to describe here.
And that's sort of the rainforest analogy or ocean ecosystem analogy.
I think what you've summarized, those alternatives come quite close to the 4 alternatives that Werner Vinge had in his 1993 paper, where Ray Kurzweil really just picked up one of those 4 alternatives, namely the moment when computers will exceed human intelligence. But the other 3, to me, were much more interesting. And the first was this idea of augmented individual intelligence. But then, to me, the most exciting, and where I think you might be headed, is the human-machine interaction, which is, so it's not all humans or all machines, but how do we work together?
What was the third? There were 4?
There were 4. There was.
Can you use the microphone? Sorry.
Now, I'm not sure I'm going to get him exactly right on this, but I actually contacted him because I wanted to cite him, and I wanted to make sure that my hypothesis that Ray Kurzweil had picked only one was, that he felt that there were these other 3. So the one was the augmented individual, the prosthesis, and the second one was the linked. Pretty much what Kevin Kelly has said, and the third was the human-machine interaction,
and
then finally the Ray Kurzweil.
Oh, and the fourth
the moment, just the machine.
Yeah. So, some people refer to that as the hard takeoff, which is somehow all of a sudden machines are smarter, and there's no humans inside the internet to turn them off or make them different. Other different thoughts? Ideas?
Is he biting of lips? Raising of hands? Anyone?
I think there was something I touched on a little bit, which is in a complex system like a human, there's not just these fast staccato electrical signals that are our consciousness. Like how conscious we are or not has to do with our nutritional health and how much oxygen we have and whether or not we've had a glass of wine. And there are subtle things that can have huge impacts on our state of consciousness that, what are the equivalent of those things in a computer or on an internet? Like the lack of electricity, or what exactly?
One of the other things, I think primarily we're right now conversing
with metaphors, which I think are very powerful. But as this guy was saying, it's really not science. And for science, you would really want a falsifiable test. And one of the questions that I've been trying to ask is, if there was not consciousness, but if there was intelligence on the internet, if the internet had emergent intelligence, what would be a test that would be convincing to a skeptic, which is how science would run?
Please take LSD and answer these 3 questions afterwards.
Yeah, that doesn't work for science.
It would affect a human much differently than a
right. So one of the interesting things is that SETI, which is a search for extraterrestrial intelligence, doesn't actually even have a definition of intelligence. They stopped looking for intelligence long ago because it was basically there was no criteria. So they're looking for anonymous signals. They're just looking for things that patterns of any sort. And if you apply that, if you did what I was calling a search for internet intelligence, if you had a program called the Search for Internet Intelligence, and you were trying to find whether there was intelligence right now on the internet, looking for those kind of signals is really not meaningful because there is so much human. I mean, the whole thing is just those kinds of signals to begin with. So you're left with wrestling with a definition of, well, setting aside consciousness, you just said, if there was looking for intelligence on the internet that was at a different level, what would we look for? What would be a test that would be falsifiable and adequate for a skeptic? And it's I don't have an answer, but that would be something that perhaps people here might have a suggestion on. One idea is to make it look like these kinds of signals, but try to find it at a level that we should not expect to find it if it was just human. Or else it's coming up with a definition, some criteria of intelligence. And you would think that people who work with animals or other things would have a test, but there isn't actually a one. I mean, we look at the crows and we say, oh yeah, but that's not scientific in any sense of the word. So it may be that people here might have more knowledge about that and know about an elementary test for intelligence that we could use. So anyway, that's my call for requests.
That's a valuable point. I think, as you know, that Ray Kurzweil and Mitch Kapor have a long now bet as far as whether or not a computer intelligence will be indistinguishable from a human by the year 2029. And they've made a much more rigorous test than the Turing test as far as how it be distinguished whether the computer intelligence were intelligent than a human. So it couldn't be as simply tricked. But the rules of that intelligence test are on the Long Now bet site, where Ray Kurzweil is betting that by 2029, some extension of something like Watson or Google will have exceeded a human. And Mitch Kapor, who has a background in psychology as well, is betting that it by 2029, you still won't be able to trick a human. Partly premised on humans are exquisitely good at judging the kind of integrity and sincerity and reality of other humans for breeding and other purposes. And so for a machine to fake that is more difficult than an optimist would think.
So let me just say something about that. I'm on the panel that has to decide that.
Okay, so that's our site. That decision will come down to me and some other folks. So help me with a definition so we can decide that.
If I may. The banks beat the Turing test about a decade ago. I frequently I know. I frequently talk when I'm speaking over the phone to someone claiming to be representing a bank and ask them whether they're a human or a machine. And sometimes you have to do that 5 or 6 times before either the machine identifies itself or the human identifies itself. I think what's interesting here is for the skeptics, it's very difficult to turn a skeptic. And certainly if you develop artificial life simulations, if you develop bottom-up artificial intelligence, many of us have just left this discussion because you're dealing with perceptions which become beliefs, which become points of argument which are so completely orthogonal to the work that we are doing or trying to do, that it's far more interesting actually to continue to do our work than to engage with these kind of arguments. Because there are beliefs here which go beyond the experiential, understanding that you have actually working with these simulation systems. And unfortunately, the prize that you've talked about has lost course with people who are actually doing, continued development and research in this area for exactly that reason.
Well, I don't know if it's lost course. I mean, Ray Kurzweil is working at Google trying to muster all the resources of Google to win that prize.
Well, as a simulator, I'm saying it has lost course from my experience.
Yeah.
For the number of the reasons that have been discussed this evening.
Interesting that you've had the experience of calling banks and them pretending to be humans. I have the opposite problem of humans calling my banks pretending to be me.
Well, yes, and that is an interesting... Any additional questions, any additional points?
I think that...
I think the bet's passed. I think it's ridiculous, and I think the nature...
So you think that Ray already won?
No, I think I don't think it's an either-or, which is the first part of the problem. I don't think there are two distinct possibilities here. And I don't think Ray's argument represents what I've experienced developing simulation. I think there's something that's gone on that's completely independent of the bet, and the bet is basically a linguistic argument between two groups that have nothing to do with the experience that I've had and the experience that other, folks in a variety of fields have had. It's become a conversation in and of itself.
Two people made a bet, and we'll have, whether the bet is valid, whether someone else thinks the bet is stupid, doesn't matter. There's still a bet between two people that we have to adjudicate. And so the bet exists independent of other people's opinions of the bet. So if you were on the panel to decide the bet, you would have to give the money to one side or the other. So we can't escape that.
You can.
No, you can't.
There are plenty of prizes that have never been awarded, plenty of bets that have never been divided. The whole notion that this is something that is very real exists to you because you're a part of it. It doesn't exist to, the simulation community, people that are doing independent work. It's an independent thing.
Yeah. So I'm asking if anybody else here would have any suggestions about how we could, I know you don't want to cooperate with the bet, but maybe there are other people who would have some suggestions about a way that we could identify either intelligence on the internet, emergent intelligence, or any other criteria, scientific falsifiable criteria. Do you have a suggestion right here?
No. I'm just saying that if you have a bet and you haven't figured out how to settle it, then you probably don't really have a bet either.
Oh, man.
Yeah. I think what I find most interesting about the bet, though, is it's from the perspective of the human. That the human has to determine whether the machine is intelligent or not. And what the funny thing is, you've got a lot of corporations developing software to determine what the intent of the human is inside an organization. And that's the other perspective of that argument, is can the intelligence in the machine determine if that's a human intent or another machine intent? And until you address both perspectives of that argument, you're not really addressing, I think, the heart of the bet.
And to kind of reinforce that point a little bit, and to, I think, one of Tom's original points at the beginning, it's almost as if the question of, is it conscious, is it not, is it alive, is it not, in some ways can become academic, because the reality is, in general, people, unless they're doing pure research, are building products. And these products will leverage either lifelike attributes or intelligence or consciousness attributes, some of which may be emergent, some of which may be programmed. But I think that just like, we don't worry about whether a car is like a horse or not, although we do use horsepower still, which a horse...
country at least.
Yeah, and horsepower is only 0.8 horse, which doesn't make any sense. But so in that same sense, these intelligent programs, devices, whatever they end up being, will exist, and they will serve a purpose. Sometimes they will serve their own purpose. Over time, most of the time, they will serve the purpose of the human being who created them. And they may be alive, they may be not. Star Wars explored this. Are the droids alive, right? And it's, and the droids are more human, C-3PO and R2-D2, than the human characters. That's one of the main tensions in the Star Wars saga. So it's this idea of, I don't think this question will ever be fully answered, and maybe it's not even meaningful.
Well, I think that's the key word, and your point of pulling back to SETI, and their going to signals, and the question of whether the signal is actually there's a pattern that can be recognized, and if there's a pattern that can be recognized, does that pattern have meaning? And if that pattern has meaning, was that meaning ascribed by the sender or by the receiver? And it seems that you have to at least start there.
Well, so there's one bit of help to that test is adding some biological psychiatry criterion in that a human would respond differently to than a emergent intelligence. And it doesn't mean that the intelligence might be smarter at Jeopardy, but it wouldn't necessarily be the best date. So there are different criterion as far as what parameter is of value. And the SETI thing sort of brings to mind, there's an explanation to Fermi's paradox about why we can't see intelligent life in other locations, which John Smart and others call the transcension hypothesis, which is as complexity as evolves and as things become more and more complex, they can either speciate into two ways. They can either go explosive like we are now, where we're spending rockets and sending TV and radar up into space and all kinds of signals everywhere. That's what we're doing. And so we're assuming that's what other species or other life elsewhere would be doing. An alternate speciation branch is things becoming quieter, calmer, smaller, less easy to detect, or the transcension hypothesis is as complexity gets more, it actually continues to increase in complexity, but becomes much more efficient and quieter. So as the internet has gone from wireless to fiber, for example, it's a lot harder to see from space. And that the complexity of the chips and the complexity of things inside a phone are getting increasingly complex and smaller, but much smarter and sophisticated in a way, but more difficult to see from afar. So it's quite possible that the path for more complicated life forms than we have on this planet is to things that are much quieter and more efficient and almost invisible. So the search for them might be more difficult than we think.
I think what we've done here is started a discussion that needs to be continued. But I think there are probably, as I noted, associated with the Internet Archive, participants that would like to have their issues raised independently of the carbon life forms in front of us this evening. What I would like to do, because a number of you know each other and you've used your first names, if you could give for the folks who've spoken this evening, if you could give your name and an introduction for people who are listening in so they can look up your work and get a sense of who you are.
Hi, I'm Ben, and I'm a software engineer. That sounds like I'm an alcoholic. I'm just kind of interested in artificial life, and I've been working on my own artificial life simulation, a little bit like Polyworld or Noble Ape, and I think that's very cool what you guys are doing, and that's why I'm here.
I'm Kevin Kelly. I wrote a book called What Technology Wants. And I'm also sort of on I was one of the founders of the Long Bets site. So,
my name is David. I've been doing research originally in virtual reality, doing some original experimentation in artificial life back in the 90s, more recently doing voice-controlled, contextual-based systems for cars and televisions.
My name is John. I'm an engineer, and for the past several years, I've been building intelligent devices that are in people's homes today.
Do I have one?
Yeah, I'm Jamie Faye Fenton. I'm also a software engineer, been interested in artificial life for at least as long as Reese has. Okay, there you go.
I'm Zan Gill, and I'm writing a book which spawned a second book, and so I'm now writing two simultaneously. And the first is entitled If Microbes Begat Mind, and the subtitle is From Origins of Life to Emergence of Intelligence. And the second one is called What Daedalus Told Darwin, a Darwin's Dilemma and the Struggle for Existence. So I was obviously talking about things I care a lot about.
I am Leslie, a computer engineer. Most of my life I was developing distributed systems such as the cloud today and the context-aware location-specific systems. And my pet project is an IT definition of the human persona, whether it's consciousness or identity or personhood, however we call it. And one particular way that's intriguing is building a bridge between something like a Google Glass and the biological neocortex. I think that would give an answer to those questions.
So I'm Reese Jones, and you can find out more about me on Facebook, but I'm helped start Singularity University. I'm a trustee at the Santa Fe Institute. I'm on the Genetics Advisory Council at Harvard Med School, and I do a lot of startup things, especially in synthetic biology, with a DNA laser printer making, turning bits into atoms, and making programmable life programming in DNA.
And I had the privilege of introducing myself at the start of this. I'm Tom Barbalet. This has been part of a meetup group. There are a number of folks that contribute through mailing lists and Facebook and LinkedIn and a wide variety of sources. But if you would like to attend this, and I'm speaking to folks who aren't here, the way to do that is to go to meetup.com and look up Conscious in the Cloud. We are currently based in the South Bay, but we might be doing things in the North Bay. We might be doing things all over. So please get in contact through Meetup or Facebook or a wide variety of means. And thank you to everyone this evening for coming to attend this in Carbon.
And thanks to Tom and to Netflix for hosting us.